Before we begin, we would like to give a massive thank you to the sponsors of today's show, June's Journey.
Our episodes deal with serious and often distressing incidents. Listener discretion is advised.
Aberdeen, the Granite City. Earning its nickname from the many grey buildings built from locally quarried granite around the city, Aberdeen sits on the northeast coast of Scotland, adjacent to the North Sea. Its terrain is somewhat unusual, boasting not only high coastal cliffs and long stretches of beaches on its north seaside, but rugged cityscapes and dense forests as you come inland, all within relatively close proximity. In the 1970s, Aberdeen was primarily known for two things: its historic university, and for being at the forefront of the oil boom in the UK. King's College, which would eventually become the University of Aberdeen, was founded in 1494 and cemented Aberdeen's status as one of the top 40 oldest universities to remain in continuous operation to this day. King's College was eventually merged with Marischal College, the city's second university, which had opened in 1593, into what is now known as the University of Aberdeen in the late 19th century. Considered a first-rate place of education, the institution was a fundamental part of the spirit of Aberdeen. However, just over a century after the merger between King's and Marischal College, modern Aberdeen would become synonymous with something else entirely: oil. Large petroleum companies were keen to extract the value from the so-called black gold, commonly known as crude oil, swelling underneath the newly minted oil fields in the North Sea off of Scotland's northeast coast. This in turn brought workers in their droves, looking to ensure they got a slice of the pie. By 1978, with oil flowing freely through the pipes abutting Aberdeen, the oil price had risen nearly 12 times higher than a decade previous, and the city was getting fat off of the profits. Aberdeen soon played home to oil tycoons and deep-pocketed offshore workers as the city prospered, adding oil capital of Europe as well as the Granite City to its list of nicknames. Each of the oil-producing fields were serviced by new money engineers, workers and data heads that enabled companies like Texaco, BP, Hamilton Oil, RTZ and the Trans-European Company to turn crude oil into profit. The life of an oil worker typically revolved around time on and off the rigs. The rigs were large structures built in the sea with the capacity to extract crude oil. When on rig, they lived in dorms within the structure itself, and when off rig, they either returned home or spent time in Aberdeen working in offices or awaiting transport to the rig itself. This meant that for many workers, they spent significant amounts of time alone in Aberdeen. These workers were mostly well paid and had money to spare after spending weeks away, and with that, brought opportunity.
I'm Jess, and this is Skinwalker.
Dr. Brenda Page, or as she was known then, simply Brenda Page, was born in 1946 in Ipswich, a county in eastern England. She had shown promise academically throughout her childhood at Northgate Grammar School, excelling in her studies. This progressed on into further education, whereby she graduated from London University, before heading north of the border to Scotland, where she completed her PhD in genetics at the University of Glasgow, finally prefixing doctor to her name as a salutation. It was here at the University of Glasgow where she met Christopher Harrison, a fellow scientist with whom she immediately clicked. Christopher had come from Gloucestershire in southwest England. The two students held similarly high ambitions for their careers and bonded over their joint passions and their joint difficulties from living so far away from home. Eventually, they turned from friends to lovers, and in May of 1972, they were married at St Mary le Tower Church in Ipswich, with Brenda wearing a dress she had designed and made herself. 1 year later, they moved to Aberdeen after Brenda landed a job at the city's university in the genetics department. The university still held renown as one of the most prestigious in Scotland, counting Nobel Prize winners, former Chancellor of the Exchequer Alistair Darling, and actor Ian Glenn amongst its alumni. Christopher soon followed in Brenda's footsteps, as he too secured a job at the university, working in the biochemistry department. Unfortunately for the pair, their marital bliss was not to last. The relationship began to break down over time, and in 1977, after agreeing to part ways amicably, their divorce was granted. Brenda soon moved into her own place at number 13 Allen Street in Aberdeen and purchased 3 cats to share the space with her. She redoubled her focus on her work, which involved pioneering research for the Department of Energy, investigating the dangers faced by divers in the North Sea oil industry. Given the stakes at play with the oil boom, this was particularly critical research, both for the divers themselves and the industry as a whole. As she packed up for the day on Thursday, July 13 in 1978, she had agreed to hand over some research she had completed to a colleague the following day before saying her goodbyes. Brenda then returned home and got dressed for dinner. She met with 2 men described as, quote, looking like businessmen at the Treetops Hotel on Springfield Road in Aberdeen. She was then seen leaving the hotel at around 2 a.m. on Friday the 14th of July, heading for home in her beige Mini Clubman. The following day, just after 2 p.m, with Brenda having failed to appear for work, her colleague had decided to check in on her for the promised research material from the day previous. As he was knocking on the door, he had caught the attention of Elizabeth Gordon, Brenda's neighbour, who approached to ask what was going on. When he informed her of his purpose at Brenda's door, they had a look around to avoid disturbing Brenda if she just wasn't in the mood for visitors. After noticing a smashed window, their knocks on Brenda's door had become louder. With no answer meeting their frantic knocks, Elizabeth quickly returned to her home to fetch the spare key she had been entrusted with by Brenda. Making their way to the back door of the property, Elizabeth opened the locked door and edged through. Brenda's cats purred and nudged into her leg as she entered. Still unsure whether Brenda was in the property, she quietly made her way through the home and slowly edged open her bedroom door. Inside, they found Brenda Page lying in her bed, but not as Elizabeth Gordon had expected her to be. Brenda lay sprawled on her bed, fully clothed, battered clearly to death by a heavy instrument. The only description that Elizabeth Gordon could give was, quote, I saw nothing but blood and hair. Elizabeth let out a scream as Brenda's work colleague prepared to enter. A call was then made to police to alert them that Brenda Page was dead. Following the discovery of Brenda's body, the police, under the supervision of head detective DCI Jim Ritchie, searched the home to find any potential clues. Brenda's body was forensically examined by the forensics team, which were admittedly more limited in 1978 than they would be today. By looking at the marks and wounds on her body, they were able to ascertain that whoever had murdered Brenda had been intent on inflicting as much damage to her as possible. She had been beaten repeatedly by a blunt object, and she had not been sexually assaulted. No neighbours had heard anything untoward, or screams, or, somewhat interestingly, the glass being broken. The marks from the weapon indicated that the instrument could be no more than 3/4 of an inch in diameter, meaning it was likely something like a poker, spanner, or tyre lever. No weapon or instrument was found in the property that could match the wounds inflicted on Brenda, meaning that her killer had taken it with them as they left the house. This gave the police further cause to think later when they analysed the fact that along with not being able to recover a murder weapon, the research papers which Brenda had promised to hand over to a colleague were never recovered either. Had the killer taken these with them? Their first port of call after the body itself was the broken window. The window had been broken from the outside to gain access to the property, leaving the possibility that this could have been a burglary gone wrong. The breaking pattern on the glass indicated that the same tool which was used to kill Brenda may have also been used to gain access to the flat itself. When considering robbery, however, the police came to a now obvious realisation. Nothing of value looked to have been removed from the flat, and there was no sexual motive to the crime. What burglar doesn't burgle, but kills instead? What opportunist sexual offender doesn't commit a sexual offence when they have the opportunity, only killing instead? Very few, if any. This was a murder case, without doubt. For the police, the next steps would have been simple in most cases. Establish a nexus of contacts of Brenda. Find those who may harbour a grudge or want her dead. Interview, dig, establish motive, find evidence, charge, and pass them over for prosecution. But this was not to be one of those simple cases. The entire case flipped on its head when an enterprising officer, in their search through her possessions, uncovered a card in her drawer. The card was basic in style, but analysis of its content uncovered that Brenda had been living somewhat of a double life. Dr. Brenda Page, academic by day, had been working as a companion-style escort by the name of Miss Brenda Adams in Aberdeen by night. She would carry out this work a few nights a week to supplement her income from the university. Her divorce from Christopher Harrison had taken time and cost money. This was an easy way to build her savings back up. The work itself was all above board. She would accompany men who had paid for her time and companionship to dinner and the many corporate events being held in the city. Her clientele were particularly well off too, With the oil boom, companies sent their executives to Aberdeen to ensure offices were set up and their interests were being managed appropriately. These executives often attended events while in the city. However, travelling alone meant that many were willing to part with cash for a companion for the evening. Brenda herself saw this as a way to socialise and have fun while meeting new people. Escorting in the 1970s was not exactly the same as it is today. Detective Inspector Gary Winter of Police Scotland stated, "Most people's accepted definition of being an escort now is very different to what it was 40 years ago. Nowadays, if we use that word, people assume the person is involved in the sex industry. That was not the case in 1978. What it did mean was that Brenda got to attend glamorous events, eat nice food, meet well-off and well-to-do people, and go out socialising in an era before the internet, dating websites and apps. If there was a sexual element, it was not outwardly advertised or displayed." Brenda was registered with Capital Escort Agency, a company which was primarily run out of Edinburgh, but also had girls on the books in Aberdeen. Capital Escort Agency supplied companionship for a price. The ladies of this agency were not only to be beautiful, they were also to provide intellectual conversation and engage with their customer. Brenda Page fit the bill entirely. She was tall and beautiful with long brown hair. Given her academic background, she was clearly well read and she had a polite demeanour. Her research into the effects of diving in the North Sea oil industry also meant that she would no doubt have been able to engage in intellectual conversation with her clients about their own field. What this meant in practice was there were now two avenues for murder: personal relationships and those she had come into contact with in her escorting work. The police also released a statement alerting anyone who may have been in the vicinity of the area at the time of the crime to come forward. They further stated that the assailant would have been blood-soaked as they left the flat, meaning they would have either drawn attention through their appearance or have ditched their blood-stained clothing after committing the murder. Local waste workers were informed to keep an eye out for anything suspicious in this regard. When drawing up a list of suspects, the two lines of inquiry led to two key suspect pools: the men Brenda had spent the evening before with, whom the police were in the process of investigating, and her ex-husband, because, as the old adage goes, it's always the ex-husband. In respect of the newly discovered line of interest, Capital Escort Agency were contacted by the police. William Austin, the boss of the escort agency, was questioned by police as they tried to piece together her final movements from Thursday 13th into Friday 14th. Austin stated to the police that Brenda had indeed worked for his agency, and he had spent an evening with her in early July when the pair had went for dinner together. He recalled that on the night Brenda seemed to be frightened and concerned for her safety, but told him nothing that would have given him any idea of who was making her feel this way. When consulting with the bookings made, Austin told police that Brenda had spent the evening of July 13 with two male companions who had paid in advance for her time. Austin stated, "It was a very peculiar arrangement we had for that night. I was phoned by some people from their motor car. A telephone in the car was quite a thing in those days. They arranged to meet her at a hotel that I nominated. I usually met the customers, but if they were in Aberdeen, I couldn't always do it, as I lived in Edinburgh. Austin further stated he felt that Brenda's life was friendless and lonely. All of this likely built a feeling of quiet disconcert for the police. Perhaps these were their men, only they weren't. The two men Brenda had spent the evening with were spoken to by police. However, they were quickly ruled out of the investigation as suspects, and the information they provided enabled some of the blanks about Brenda's final hours to be filled in. Her car was accounted for, being parked nearby to her house. This meant that the police knew for certain Brenda had arrived home sometime around 2:30 a.m, and her murder must have occurred soon after. Dr. Christopher Harrison, Brenda's ex-husband, was questioned, but they had scant little to go on. He was a respected scientist, able to account for his movements on the night in question. His divorce to Brenda had not been particularly messy, and he seemed, on the face of things at least, to be heartfelt and genuine in his grief. As such, after the interview, police accepted his version of events and he was released from custody. Christopher soon released a statement to express his sorrow at what had happened to his ex-wife and how he hoped that her killer was brought to justice. Police believed the man to be responsible, but had already ruled out the men known to Brenda. This shallow suspect pool was not helped after the revelation of her work as an escort emerged. Rumours from the public soon followed. Members of the public stated their belief that this line of work could be dangerous and that going on dates with unknown men put Brenda in danger. Despite little evidence of the sort, the weight of the courtroom of public opinion was suggesting that her murder was linked to her work as an escort. When examining her work as an escort, police found that she rarely divulged any details of her personal life to her clients and had informed her mother of her second occupation. Coupled with the fact she had driven herself to the meeting at the Treetops rather than allowing herself to be dropped off by the men who paid for her time, this meant a significant lapse in security, which would lead some unknown party to her door, seemed rather far-fetched. The police were effectively back to square one. Police did have one further line in inquiries, due to one eyewitness from Allen Street on the morning of the murder. A milkman came forward and stated he had seen a man leaving the property in the early hours of July 14. After giving his description to police, a photo fit was drawn up and distributed across the city on over 50,000 posters, whilst loosely tying the man in the photo to another aspect of their investigation. A dark green Mini Countryman, which may have been in the area between 9 p.m. and 6 a.m. from July 13 to July 14. The photo fit was fairly generic and showed a male with thick dark hair and a thick moustache. Unfortunately, a common look for the time. The people of Aberdeen were now living in fear that a murderer was on the loose. Lone men walking the streets late at night were being questioned by locals, with reports of some being attacked as they were accused of being the man in the photo fit. In an attempt to stop the scaremongering in the city, police made an announcement to say it was highly likely that Brenda knew her killer. How this statement tied in with their investigation's pool of suspects stagnating so rapidly is unknown. One thing it did allow the police to note publicly was that given the general state of the bedroom, it seemed that Brenda had struggled and that her murderer may have been scratched or hurt in the struggle. If he had been, perhaps it would make people question him, or at least make him start sweating. They also, without much explanation, conducted a search in Edinburgh, some 120 miles apart, for the murder weapon, and brought passengers of the 6:25 a.m. Aberdeen to Edinburgh train from July 14, the day of the murder, in for questioning. A further statement was provided, stating that the police were looking for assistance in recovering a green duffel bag, blood-stained clothing, shoes, and a watch, and that locals should be on the lookout for these items. Again, no explanation as to how this tied into the wider investigation was given to the public or the media. For the blood-stained clothing and shoes, no explanation was necessary, but why a green duffel bag and a watch? Did the police know something they weren't letting on? It seemed like they were trying to ramp the pressure up on someone or something. But if they were, the lead slipped by them, as nothing further was mentioned in this regard. Amidst all of this, Brenda was buried in Rushmere, St Andrew, nearby to her hometown, on the 27th of July, with her mother, sister, and numerous colleagues in attendance. There seemed to be momentum in the investigation once again on August 2, as police shifted their focus. This time, their sights had moved their search to the River Dee. The River Dee is a 140-kilometre stretch of water which flows through the Eastern Highlands before passing through Aberdeen to reach the North Sea. It seemed as good a place as any to dump evidence, given long-term exposure to water has a way of destroying much of the useful information investigations are built on. Divers scoured the river for clues, but once again, this turned up nothing. Brenda's sister Rita Ling and her mother Florence Page had even travelled from Ipswich to Aberdeen to assist in the investigation, although they were so far removed from Brenda's life in Aberdeen that they could not provide any further evidence to that which they had already gained. In total, police gathered over 2,500 statements, with none of these leading to a break in the case. The green duffel bag, the watch, bloodied clothing, and identifit did nothing. Then, in a tremendous blow for the family, on June 20, 1980, after 23 months of investigations, police announced the inevitable, that the case would be shelved, with all inquiries ceasing, and the case now being classed as unsolved. And that was the fate of Brenda Page, to be another unsolved file, gathering dust in an unmarked filing cabinet in Aberdeen. Her mother, Florence, died never knowing justice, or even who had killed her daughter. However, Brenda's file did get a shake-off, after advances in DNA testing raised hopes for the case in 2004. Testing techniques had improved significantly, and it was hoped that police would open the case back up to investigate. Brenda's remaining family members promoted the case in the hopes of having the DNA from the scene re-examined, although this never materialised. Then, on November 29, 2011, further hope was given to Brenda's family. A special cold case unit was set up to help police in the north and northeast tackle unsolved murders and other serious crimes. There were several cases in these areas that had led to the forming of this cold case unit, including that of Renee and Andrew McRae, which was covered in episode 6 of Skinwalker. However, the immediate hope once again turned into disappointment, as the case was not prioritised and Brenda's murder seemed to have been overlooked. If you're looking for a fun way to relax, then check out the app June's Journey. Set in the roaring 1920s, hundreds of colourful and carefully crafted room decors give each level a great backdrop to this hidden object mystery game. You take on the role of June as she returns home to her family's estate to find her sister murdered and embarks on her search to solve the crime. Along the way, you will uncover what is the start of many family secrets while travelling the world and getting June out of tricky situations. Since I've started playing the game, I've found my brain function clearer as it freshens up my thinking with the quick problem solving. With over 3 million players of the game, it's clear to see why June's Journey is a hit. You can download June's Journey for free on the Apple App Store or Google Play by following the link in today's show notes. In February 2015, Lord Advocate Frank Mulholland QC made an announcement on a visit to Aberdeen. The Lord Advocate in Scotland is the senior law officer. As head of the systems for the prosecution of crime and investigation of deaths in Scotland, they have the power to reopen closed cases, and he did just that. He said in his statement, "The reinvestigation of this case will be conducted by Police Scotland's North Major Investigation Team, headed by Detective Superintendent Malcolm Stewart, under the direction of the Cold Case Unit, the specialist team based at the Crown Office, which examines historic cases. We continually review unsolved homicides, and I have decided this is a case which should be reinvestigated." The case had remained unsolved for 37 years, with a killer on the loose. If justice was to come, it would be a long time in coming. Brenda's sister Rita Ling noted her hope in relation to the reopening of the case. Her hope was buoyed by the fact that the Cold Case Unit had already cracked a case from the same year as Brenda's and from the same area, that of Kazi Ahmad. Kazi's murder had taken place at a flat in the Rosemount Viaduct area of Aberdeen, only 1 mile from the scene of Brenda's murder on Allen Street. Kazi had been stabbed to death in his own home before his attacker fled the scene, leaving no trace. In similar circumstances to those of Brenda's, initial investigations had ruled out more suspects than it had flagged up. In the end, it turned out to be a man that Kazi had provided with employment and accommodation that had been responsible for his murder. Riyasat Khan worked as a chef at Kazi Ahmad's restaurant, and the two were often seen going to the casino after shifts. Ahmad had then fled abroad, only returning to the UK in the 90s. When asked by Judge Lord Beckett why it had taken 39 years to eventually prosecute Riyasat Khan and deliver justice to Ahmad's family, the prosecution were unable to answer. Perhaps this points to poor investigating at the time, which may tie in with the handling of Brenda's case. However, rather than focus on the failings of the past, now was a time for her family to feel positive that this team were capable of cracking open this type of case. Around 75 policemen and detectives were assigned to Brenda's case after the reopening of the investigation. One of the first jobs for the Cold Case Unit was to take the witness statements from the initial investigation and enter this data onto the computer database. Once input, This would allow them to cross-reference all statements and accounts from then with any new information, in the hope that something might flag up. 2 years had passed in the reinvestigation, and still no substantial breakthrough had been made. This upset Rita, who felt that there hadn't been much progress at all in her eyes. In an interview in 2017, she stated, quote, "I don't know whether they really have anything to go on. I had hoped with some of the new advances they might have found some more information, but there's been nothing. The police sounded quite optimistic when they reopened the case, but I haven't heard anything." Almost a year later, in July of 2018, as the 40th anniversary of her murder approached, Rita Ling and Detective Inspector Gary Winters, who worked in the North East Division's headquarters on the case, made an appeal for anyone with any information relating to the case to come forward, no matter how big or small they thought their contribution may be. Winters explained that the 2015 appeal after the reopening of the case had drawn significant attention, and that they received 800 new statements and pieces of information from people connected to the case. Rita reflected on the life of her incredibly talented sister and spoke of her hope that she would see justice in her lifetime. Only 5 months later, in December of 2018, Detective Inspector Winters conducted another interview in which he stated, "You have to be honest with families and tell them you'll do your best and try and get the best possible outcome. However, you have to be realistic as well, and with the amount of time that has passed, it's going to take something significant for there to be a big break." It seemed in light of these statements, perhaps that Rita's misgivings about the chance of a successful prosecution were well founded. Wounds from the first investigation had been picked at, in hopes of success second time around, but Rita was just being hurt twice. These same wounds were dragged up again for the family in September of 2019, when the case of Renee and Andrew McRae was brought back into the spotlight as a man was charged with their murder over 40 years since their disappearance in 1976. This, thanks to the work of the cold case team, brought another long-standing unsolved case in the north of Scotland nearer to a conclusion. Undoubtedly, Brenda's family would have felt compassion for the family who had finally received justice, but it is likely that they were saddened too to see so many cases around Brenda's coming to a conclusion while they felt no further forward. Then, on March 17, 2020, they were finally justified in sticking by the investigation. Despite all of the pitfalls and all of the heartbreak, a 79-year-old man was arrested in connection with the case. The BBC then reported that the man was Christopher Harrison, the ex-husband of Brenda. He appeared at Aberdeen Sheriff Court. He made no plea and was released on bail. After the murder of Brenda, Christopher Harrison had made a new life for himself in Holland. Details thereafter and those on the case are now scarce, although the case is progressing daily, albeit hampered by the coronavirus pandemic. Harrison was released on bail while the case against him is committed for further examination. His trial date has not yet been set. The details of the prosecution's case against Christopher Harrison have not been revealed, and we may need to wait until after the trial to find out exactly what evidence there is. Brenda's sister, now 85 years old, said upon hearing of the arrest, "I don't know how to feel. but it's the most positive thing to come out of it. I can't believe it. We will have to wait and see what happens. Hopefully there will be a conclusion. Detective Inspector Gary Winters also made a statement in which he asked for anyone with any information which may prove of use in the case against Dr. Christopher Harrison for the murder of Dr. Brenda Page still to come forward. Perhaps the case is not quite as close to being over as the charge would suggest.